So you might say that the last reading in the first half of the course was really the David Hume essay on the academical philosophy. I think it's called. It's really about skepticism. I can get my screen working. Really, what is skepticism? Of course, skepticism is just from, let's say, the Humean, David Hume's point of view, skepticism, the thesis that we really can't know anything, or at least know it for sure, or at least know it with certainty. But really, the question is it our knowledge of the external world, the physical world? I mean, you and I have some sort of sensation. We could even call it a perception. But the notion is that these are internal experiences. We're having some sort of mental activity, and all sorts of seemings go on. We seem to see this, we seem to see that. It seems to indicate that our sensation is caused by, or our perception is of, some external object of some sort. Now, let's think about that expression, external object. Really, the fundamental idea of an external object is that it's external to me, that it exists independently of me, that object. But this, a sensation or perception, certainly does not exist independently of me. So, if all I really experience and that is a state of me, that is an internal state. I say that's the question. If all I really experience is a sensation or perception, and that is a state of me, my mind, let's say, how can I be sure that it relates to anything external to me? And the Hume's answer is, uh, you can't. As you can't be sure. Philosophically, at least, skepticism is unassailable. It wins skepticism philosophically. It is you'll never be able to make that leap from, well, if presumably I'm experiencing an internal state, if my sensation is somehow my mind being affected in a certain way, having a certain affection, then how could I ever say that it relates to something physical and something external to me? Some philosophers would say the very idea is absurd. I don't think Hume would say that. It would just that there's just no way you can prove it. So if we take skepticism to be a skepticism of our knowledge of external objects, I think Hume says it definitely wins. It's, uh, it's impossible to prove that our internal states somehow are caused by or relate to or even represent external objects that are independent of us. So it's philosophically strong, but practically it leads nowhere. It is, first of all, no one is really, except for philosophers, really that bothered by it. They have that instinct. What did he call animal faith? We walk around with this sort of animal instinct or faith. that there is an external world and our sensations put us in contact with it. And although we can't prove it rationally, and perhaps there are all sorts of philosophical reasons to disbelieve it, we believe it anyway. We live our lives blithely, unable to prove that there's an external world or that we can have knowledge of it. But it doesn't really bother us. So it's practically weak. It leads nowhere. We've got to live our lives. It's a very interesting essay. So at this point, we might even draw a line and say that this finishes the first half of the course on critical reasoning. Now it's with Kant's "What is Enlightenment" that we enter into a new sort of examination of reason. More of the social value of reasoning. This is maybe the middle of the course, the second part of the course, rather than the last half of the course. And of course, Kant is a great defender of reason, or what he calls the public use of reason. Very interesting. That reason should be free in its guise as the public use of reason. Public use of reason. What does he say? A scholar addressing the whole reading public, which is basically addressing the world as a thinker. That sort of speech or that sort of use of reason should always be free and completely free. And an interesting thing in Bury asks really why is that so, and Kant has an answer to that. So that we as the human species may get closer to enlightenment. And on the individual level, I suppose, enlightenment for Kant means the ability to think for oneself. So an enlightened society would be a society I suppose that's what it means. Most people think they can think for themselves, but that may not hold up, right? Now, the second thing we read in this was J.B. Bury's A History of Freedom of Thought, and I don't want to go over that in too much detail. It's too big and has too much historical. It's really a book of the history of the suppression of thought and its gradual emergence. It's fighting through that oppression. It's an interesting book, and maybe the most interesting chapters are the first and last ones. So that I suppose if you're going to look it over, I would concentrate on the introductory chapter and then the concluding chapter. One of the things that Bury says in the beginning is that freedom of thought is actually fairly hard to defend. Because even if we say that we have a right to freedom of thought, we have a right to a lot of things, but governments, societies have always thought it their right to suppress those rights to a certain extent. So why would we say that, even if we say that freedom of speech or freedom of thought is a natural right, on what basis would we defend it always being free? And interestingly enough, I think his answer is much like Kant's. That is, if it's only through free thought that we can hope to make progress. I would say that that's, if I'm reading it right. Of course, there's a lot more to that book. The book is really about Europe. It's about the classical period when he said freedom of thought was just part of the atmosphere to really what is the great enemy for Berry, and that's Christianity. Christianity is the bad guy in his story because it's Christianity that took it upon itself to suppress freedom of thought in defense of religious dogmatism, and it's only the throwing off of the power of Christian authority that allowed Europe to emerge in this amazing way as a great intellectual force in science, philosophy, the arts. So I don't know. It's a certain story that Berry tells. I'm going to do one more video. I'm getting a little tired, which will cover the last part of the course.